Hello, welcome to Carlson Tech Talk, a series of interviews with experts in information technology and networking industry. Hello, welcome to the talk. The internet has been a driver for both economic growth as well as for bridging people. But this popularity of the internet has also led to congestion on the network, and as a result, the infrastructure provider, that is the internet service providers, have tried out various technical and pricing solutions to cope with the congestion on their network. And this has triggered a debate about network neutrality and what kind of policies are acceptable to the people. And over the last 4 years, we have seen a much more rapid changes in pricing policy among the internet infrastructure providers than what we have seen in the previous 4 decades. And so the question is, what has changed, what lies ahead for the internet, and what does the future of internet going to look like? To answer these questions, we have with us today a leader in the networking industry, Mr. Keith Cambron. Keith has been the president and CEO of AT&T Labs, and he has also been the president and CEO of SBC Communications Labs and has held various leadership positions at Pacific Bell and Bell Labs. He has authored a book called Global Networks, Engineering, Designs and Operations. Welcome, Keith. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, you're welcome, Sonia.
Well, let's get started by talking about the elephants in the room, network neutrality and the Title II, and applying that to network carriers. So the first question that I have for you is, what are your thoughts on the ongoing network neutrality debate and the talk of applying Title II and change the service provider's designation from information services to utilities? And can you lay out the pros and cons for us from both the users as well as the provider's point of view, and how this might affect the industry investments, technology rollout, and the entire internet ecosystem as a result of applying Title II?
Sure. So we need to begin by separating Title II from net neutrality. They're related topics, but they're somewhat different. Let me begin with Title II regulation because I lived with Title II for decades. I started in Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1977, and a lot of what we had to do was comply with Title II. It's a regulation in a set of laws, Title II of the U.S. Code, for common carriers. And common carriers means utilities, airlines, taxi cabs, even cruise ships. In general, common carriers often have a monopoly position, but not always. An example would be an airlines does not necessarily have a monopoly over it, although it might over certain routes. So one is understanding what Title II means as far as the law. But if the internet access, and I think that's primarily what Chairman Wheeler's talking about, were to be placed under Title II regulation, that means the federal government can regulate all the services, and they regulate the fees, the prices the ISPs charge, and they can add their own fees to that service. The only requirement under Title II, the general requirement, is that their decision must be, quote, just and reasonable. And so the question, of course, is in whose eyes, since they're making their own rules, is it just and reasonable? No new service could be offered unless the regulators approve it. If this is opened up to state regulations, then you will see that all the innovation as far as access to ISPs and broadband will come to a screeching halt. And I say that simply because I've lived under Title II regulations. I have seen services that were completely developed and were really sought after by our customers be blocked because some small part of the business community had very good lobbyists, and those lobbyists could block the services. That's an exception. That's not what generally happens, but that is what can happen under Title II. The attorneys in Washington, D.C. are salivating. There are legions of them would love to see Title II imposed because they'll make money on both sides of the argument. They'll make money because the ISPs will have to hire more attorneys, and of course, all the businesses that can benefit from blocking or changing or reshaping the way services will be offered will be in there as well. The other thing about Title II is you can't withdraw a service once you offer it. So if a service turns out to be uneconomic or you don't have many users, as long as somebody objects in the community, then particularly with state regulators, then you'll have a very hard time to eliminate that service. A simple example, when I was working on switching systems in the 1980s, we could not shut down 8-party service from the old landlines. That means 8 different homes were using the same pair of wires. We had to develop special technology on the new switching systems because the regulators would not let us shut that service off. As far as fees are concerned, if any of you, and a lot of young people don't have a wireline phone, they of course have either wireless mobile devices or voice over IP. But if you go to someone that has a wireline phone, you look at their phone bill. In some cases, the fees constitute 1/3 of the cost of the service. And there are all kinds of fees on there for things that the state regulators and federal regulators came up with over time. Because they're fees, they don't have to undergo the scrutiny of a tax. And so that's a real consideration. An example, the Universal Service Fund was established for good reasons decades ago, but still in existence. If you had a Universal Service Fund for internet access, it would mean all the subscribers would have to pay into that fund. In some places, it's as much as 16% of the bill. And that fund then will be used to pay for other people to get broadband access that could dip into that fund. The question you asked about investments is a very good one. The Communications Act was originally passed, Telecommunications Act in 1934, that established the Federal Communication Commission and really laid the foundation for a lot of what became Title II. The act was modified in 1996. In 1996, if you go back and research some of the aspects of that law, it really caused a dramatic drop in investment in broadband in the United States. DSL in particular was hit hard. Cable was not regulated for internet access. So you had 2 technologies providing the same service, internet access, but DSL, which was on a copper pair of wires, was provided by the telephone companies, was regulated, but because cable was a different technology enough. A lot of the telcos cut their investments way back in DSL because in the 1996 Act, which is still valid, parts of it, the courts have thrown out a lot of it, but other parts are still valid. The Act says that if a common carrier under Title II in the 96 Telecommunications Act places a facility to your home, a fiber facility, they have to make that facility available to their competitor at something called long-run incremental costing, which essentially is a below-market price. So if I spend, putting a fiber to somebody's home costs, at the end of the day, about $1,500. So if I spend $1,500 to place a fiber to your home, I have to lease capacity to my competitor at just a price that's well below cost. Long-run incremental costing essentially says that if you have an airplane and someone gets on the airplane, they only have to pay for their piece of the seat that they sit in. That is, they don't pay for the plane. It's an incremental cost. So what is the incremental cost if you have vacant seats on an airplane? The incremental cost of having someone come on is virtually nil. So that delayed a lot of investment in 1996. We're seeing the same thing already start to happen in the US, where telcos are investing in broadband. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Lowell McAdam, who's the CEO of Verizon, sold about 25% of their fiber to the home, along with a lot of their wireline. If you look at Verizon, they've decided to get out of the wireline business. When the financial analyst received a presentation from Lowell, he said one of the reasons he sold the wireline business was because of net neutrality in Title II. So Verizon will not be investing in wireline broadband. And I don't know how big a role Title II and net neutrality play, but if he took the opportunity to state that to analysts, he must feel that way. If you look at AT&T, AT&T is now investing heavily in Mexico, in wireless in Mexico. They weren't doing that 2 years ago. And I've been retired from AT&T for 3 years, so nothing that I'm saying today is based on any conversation I've had with anybody in AT&T, but I do follow AT&T, Verizon, the cable companies, and everyone else. So you can end up, if you put these restrictions on, you will no doubt slow down investment. You will no doubt cause the chief financial officers of these corporations to look to other places in the world to make their investments. Whether they'll do it or not, I don't know, but they will look much more carefully. The other part of the 1996 Telecommunications Act is it calls for structural separation. Now that sounds like an innocuous term, but what it means is that the carrier has to separate what are termed competitive parts of their business from non-competitive parts. In 1998, if you ordered DSL service, you had to contact 3 different branches of Pacific Bell or Southwest Bell to get your service. They could not talk to each other. You could not call one service rep and say, I want internet service. You had to talk to 3 different ones. And that was part of the structural separation. So a lot of things come with the potential of Title II regulation. Chairman Wheeler, and I believe he's a good and honest man, says they're going to use a light hand if they get this authority. But we don't know what his successor will do. We don't know what his other commissioners will want to do. We don't know what the states will do. All of this is to solve a problem that doesn't exist. It's to keep the carriers from blocking access to websites. I have never been blocked personally. If you know of people that have been blocked, I'd love to hear the story, because the friends I talk to, now I'm not a young person, so there's a lot of sites, social sites, and other places I don't go to. But we're really taking a very heavy-handed weapon to solve a problem that we're really not sure exists. And that's just Title II. My last point, and you can see I have some passion about this topic, is that of privacy. AT&T, Verizon, Google, Microsoft, everybody in the business guards the subscribers' and customers' privacy very carefully. AT&T Labs had to work with the law agencies, and I was part of that. And I can tell you personally, our position was we will give the government everything that we're required to by law, and you have to have either a court order or what's called a lawful order from the Attorney General. But we will give them nothing more. So and that's pretty much, I think, the policy that's with the other players in the industry. Once Title II regulation is in place, it will be much like the banks. Regulators can walk into a bank and say, we see you've been engaging in some practices we don't approve of. We think we're going to fine you $20 million. And the bank well knows the regulators can shut them down, not over that particular infraction, but because they hold so much power over them in so many ways. There's so many regulations that can be used to influence their business. The same way with Title II is it gives the federal government a very large lever on the issue of privacy. I don't believe they would abuse it, but nevertheless, that's one of the implications. You know, what I'd like to do, Sonia, is come to net neutrality, which is a separate topic later, if that's fine with you.
Yeah. So the next question that I have for you is about home broadband in the US being expensive, and this has been a complaint from a consumer's perspective that we are paying a lot. So the home broadband in the US costs far more than elsewhere. For high-speed access, it costs about 3 times as much as what it costs in UK and France, 5 times as much what it costs in Korea. And now all these countries have different characteristics in terms of population density and terrain and so on. So the costs of providing the services do come into play. But do you think that one of the reasons for why we are paying such high prices for broadband services, at least at the high tiers, is because there are several national players, but at the local level, we only have just 1 or 2 main providers? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay. So first of all, I haven't looked into the prices in Europe and other places, but in the US, you can get broadband for $20 a month, depending on where you are. It's much lower speeds. So I'll take the premise, as you stated, that it's more expensive in the United States. And also, you know, I'll tackle the question of competition. So when I started in Bell Labs in 1977, I was a systems engineer working on call processing. So we developed services for the phone network. The public policy that was put forward by the government, the FCC, at that time was that business services should pay twice as much as a consumer for the exact same service. So if we connected a phone line to a business, that business would pay twice as much as if we connected the phone line to a home. If we provided 3-way calling, call forwarding, conference calling, whatever the service was, the businesses paid more. And the public policy was that businesses should subsidize universal access. Businesses should help make the consumer's rate low enough that everybody could have phone service. And so when I worked on call processing, I'd come up with new services. I had to figure out how much those services actually cost as far as hardware and software and how we implemented it. And then I had to submit an engineering analysis that was used to go to rate authorities, state and federal, so they would approve the rates. And I always had to double the rate for businesses. Today's public policy is exactly the opposite, that subscribers should subsidize business. And oddly enough, if you listen to the popular press and you listen to the talk shows, the consumer seems to want that. The consumer wants to pay more. Sounds odd, because that's what net neutrality is about. One side of net neutrality is about economics. The content on the internet, which you probably shared with your students, half of it is generated by two companies, YouTube and Netflix. Okay? Great companies, they provide great service. I use both of them. They pay nothing for transport. And so we went from a public policy where business was paying 2/3 of the total cost of the service to today, those large companies pay nothing for transport. Think of Amazon, and this is a rough analogy. If Amazon could have a business where they did not have to pay to transport their products to your home, that would be a pretty good business. And particularly if you're in an environment where, as you say, there's limited competition for the transport. To get to your home, you're typically going to have 2 or 3 providers at most for broadband. So what this causes is economic arbitration and dislocation. Simple fact. Google, with all of this traffic, only has 6 data centers in the United States. It only has 1 in the West. And so the data centers are economic. The larger you can make them and put them particularly in low-cost areas where energy is cheap and labor is cheap, you can keep the cost of your data centers down. But when you do that, when you have these huge data centers, Netflix uses Amazon's cloud services. They have 80,000 servers in a data center because it's cheaper to do it that way. Someone else has to pay the cost of transport. And so that someone else is the carriers. The carriers have to build networks. The backbone traffic grows at about 40% per year. And the carriers are paying, or the content providers are paying nothing for that. It has to go on the backs of the subscribers. Some people say to me, well, the investors ought to pay. Investors will not put money in a business that does not earn a profit. It's very simple. Adam Smith discovered that in 1776. So the investors are not going to find a losing proposition. There's only 2 parties that can pay to deliver that content, either the subscribers or the content providers. If the content providers had to pay something for the delivery of their content, they wouldn't have 6 data centers. They'd have 120, because they would put the data centers closer to where the actual demand is in order to lower their transport costs. That would cause the networks to be smaller. The carriers would have margins that are more workable, and the total cost of the transport wouldn't fall on the backs of subscribers. Now, I recognize that's not a complete explanation of why prices to subscribers might be different between 2 countries. But think about half the traffic, half of the backbone. We would use half as many routers, half as many long-haul fiber systems, not half as many employees, but substantially less employees. The network would be a lot cheaper if the content providers were forced to pay something for the transport. The business models also are interesting. Netflix charges subscribers for their service. Google makes their money off ad revenues. So it's a completely hidden revenue stream. As subscribers have to pay more for Netflix services, in theory, you can charge more for the bandwidth network uses. You can put that on the subscriber's bill. But the subscriber's not paying anything for YouTube. The revenues come from advertising. And by the way, the market capitalization of Google is about the size as AT&T and Verizon combined. It's not a small company. And their margins are about 4 to 5 times what the carrier's margins are. The carrier's margins are not that large. So again, I'm have my own point of view, as you and your students know. But think about that we've gone from a public policy where businesses help subsidize and pay for the network on a 2-to-1 basis with consumers to where today they pay nothing. And that's one of the reasons why subscribers are going to continue to see rate increases and to see their prices increase. Now, let me get back to the issue of competition and is the high price in the subscriber due to lack of competition. There is something called a natural monopoly, which your students may have talked about. How many sewer lines do you have running to your home, and how many do you need? Well, you probably need one, and it's a regulated service. How many gas lines do you need? How many power lines? And so these services are very expensive to bring to people's home. I mentioned fiber to the home. A typical number is about $1,500, more in some neighborhoods and less in others. But if somebody's going to make an investment of $1,500, they have to be sure that they'll get some return. Where there's competition, whether it's cable or telcos competing with each other, a market penetration, if you get 40%, you've done very well. So in a community of 100 homes, a typical number might be 40 of those homes might have cable service, 40 of them might have DSL or fiber to the home or VDSL from a telephone company, broadband from them. And another 20% may just use wireless. So you have that limited competition because nobody can afford the investments. And if you look at the history, you'll see cable companies never overbuilt each other. You almost never had two cable companies operating because they couldn't make money. So that's the reason the competition is limited. If any bright student or any bright investor thinks they can make money competing with the cable and telephone companies, then they need to go start a business and see if they can do that. But it's a very hard business.
Well, you mentioned about Google. So I have one question about Google. What do you think of the efforts by Google to create these gigabit fiber networks in certain cities? And although they're offering it at a similar price point, do you think that this changes the game in the networking industry?
So, in some sense, I get to sit back and smile as I watch this because Google is a great company, but they speak with different voices, and in different parts of the business are going to suffer depending on what happens. Google, if you recall, has built very selectively in the cities that they've chosen, Kansas City, Austin, and there's a few others, but they haven't built out a very large network at this point. They do it on a subdivision by subdivision basis almost. They do it selectively within the city, and that's smart. If Title II is passed, and if they become subject to Title II, they can no longer do that. Because under Title II, the regulators will say, if you're going to build out Cleveland, Ohio, you have to build out all the zip codes in Cleveland, Ohio. You can't pick and choose. So that strategy, if they're subjected to Title II, would vanish in a heartbeat. They would also, under Title II, have to lease bandwidth. So AT&T might say, you know what, we were going to go in Cleveland, but if Google's going in, maybe we don't have to. We'll just wait and buy bandwidth from them at sub-market rates below their cost. So suddenly the economics for Google going into these places could change dramatically. The real interesting part to watch is I think of three parts in Google that have a stake in all this. So Google, YouTube, the content provider, wants net neutrality to win, but without Title II. If it wins with Title II, then their fiber business will suffer greatly. If in fact they start having to pay for content delivery, then of course their whole business would suffer. The people that must really be frustrated is Google has a very capable and active group that works on a technology called Web Real-Time Communications, RTC. And it's part of HTML5, and I still write software and work with HTML5 and Java and all those good languages. And it's a very capable technology. The technology starts to make the browser as capable as the desktop. It really promotes real-time communications, and so you have HTML capabilities that let you draw. It's called the Canvas feature. All of those really neat features they're working on don't work very well over a connection that doesn't have class of service. Net neutrality says you can't have class of service. So Google is not a real competitive threat in the scope of things to carriers. The reason being, Verizon and AT&T, 80% of the revenues come from wireless, not wireline. The wireline is a relatively small part of their business these days. It's down, for AT&T, it's down around 20%. Verizon, it will soon be less than that. It'll be 10% of their business. So, precisely because Title II may chase the carriers out of the business. So we will see what happens if Title II is approved and if Google is forced into Title II. They've been very adept. And if you look at the makeup of some of their board members, you can understand why, at getting relief from the government. One of the justifications for Title II is a monopoly. And this comes into a later question I know was on the list, that of the Comcast Time Warner merger. The Sherman Antitrust Act and common law that has followed the Sherman Antitrust Act essentially says that if a business has less than 50% of a marketplace, that really the burden is on the government to explain why this business should be subjected to antitrust provisions. If a business owns more than 80% of a market, then that's deemed prima facie, or on the face of it, violation of the Antitrust Act. So if we look at Time Warner and Comcast, they do not have 80%, and in many cases, they don't have 50% of their markets. We'll talk about that in a bit. Google has 85% of their search market, but no one's ever invoked Sherman Antitrust on Google. So they may be able to convince the government that they should not be subjected to Title II, but their competitors should. That would be a sad outcome for the rule of law, but it could happen.
Well, Keith, this has been a very interesting discussion. We have many more questions for you, but let's take a short break. And viewers, please follow this conversation that we are having in the next segment.